From hook and bullet to policy and science, we're here to discuss and dissect all matters of importance to Montana's rugged landscape and the people and wildlife that call it home. This is Montana Untamed. For decades, the freight trains trundling over Marias Pass toward Glacier National Park in the Great Bear Wilderness along a 206-mile stretch of tracks between Shelby and Trego have posed a threat to grizzly bears living in the Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem, Grizzly Bear Recovery Zone, particularly when a derailment causes a grain spill or a train-killed deer or livestock carcass draws the bears onto the busy tracks. And for decades, a host of state, federal, and tribal wildlife management agencies, as well as non-governmental organizations and conservation groups, have worked with the railroad to mitigate the hazards to threatened and endangered species like grizzlies with varying degrees of effectiveness. 3 years ago, BNSF Railway Company proposed the most comprehensive solution yet when it applied to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for an Incidental Take Permit and formally submitted a habitat conservation plan outlining measures it would take to reduce train-caused grizzly mortalities in the region. But this hasn't happened yet. With me today is Tristan Scott, the managing editor of the Flathead Beacon newspaper, who's recently reported on the situation. Tristan, can you start by setting the scene for listeners on what the current scope of grizzly bear deaths along that rail line in northwestern Montana is?
Sure thing, Tom. And thanks for having me on and for providing a platform to unpack all things related to natural resource and wildlife management. It's a pleasure to listen to your conversations. So in Northwest Montana, trains hitting bears has long been a problem, particularly in the 1980s and early 90s when a series of derailments were reported and spilled grain along the right-of-way that attracted bears. These piles of grain would get rained on or snowed on, and it would ferment, and of course bears would ingest that, which was basically like a pile of corn mash that made them sleepy and they'd need to lie down and take a nap on the track, so they'd get hit. Other bears historically were attracted to dead wildlife that was hit by trains. Others still would get hit crossing trestles, such as the real prominent one near Essex and Isaac Walton Inn. Those trestles aren't equipped with motion sensor alarms, so bears try to cross the trestles, and if a train comes along, they either jump or try to outrun the train, and they can't outrun the train. And so the one thing to keep in mind is that this BNSF corridor over Marias Pass and the Continental Divide represents one of the most serious bear sinks in the Northern Rockies, and about 30 trains travel through the corridor every day. And this is skirting the southern edge of Glacier National Park.
So, and as you mentioned, this isn't a new phenomenon. Historically, this rail line has been problematic to grizzly bears in this grizzly bear dense habitat, correct?
Yep. Yeah, it's been a problem. I mean, there's data tracking bear deaths going back to 1980. So I'm looking at a chart right now, grizzly bear deaths from 1980 to 2018. Trains along that BNSF railway corridor killed or contributed to the deaths of about 52 grizzly bears from the Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem. And then in 2019, we reported pretty extensively on 8 grizzly bears that were killed as a result of railway activities, which was the most in a single year on record. So that's notable. And during that time, of course, dozens of other bears are being removed from the population due to other conflicts with humans. And then this year, things were quiet the last couple of years, and then this year we got a report that 3 grizzlies had been killed on BNSF tracks. So adding that up, that's 52 plus 11, so 63 bears since 1980. So yeah, I'd say it's been a historic issue with BNSF and that rail line.
And now, in the piece you wrote in the Beacon, you spoke with FWP personnel up there that are responding to these incidents. Can you kind of paint that picture again for folks, what it's like for the technicians and the biologists up there that have to respond to this stuff?
Sure. Well, so in Montana and in Northwest Montana, especially because we're really in the heart of this very densely populated grizzly bear recovery zone known as the Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem, we have bear conflict specialists who work for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, which is our state wildlife management agency. And they respond to all kinds of bear-human conflicts. Bears tipping over trash cans, becoming food conditioned. They start to get more brazen. Pretty soon they're breaking into cabins and vehicles and causing all kinds of issues. FWP during the spring, summer, and fall months is really these two conflict specialists are busy all the time. Now, so recognizing that in the 1990s, BNSF, which was then Burlington Northern, teamed up with FWP as well as Fish Wildlife Service, which is the federal management agency. And they worked with Glacier National Park and other public and private stakeholders to create this stewardship area that they called GNESA, the Great Northern Environmental Stewardship Area. And that was in an effort to reduce the number of train-related fatalities, sort of reasoning that these bear conflict specialists, they already had enough going on trying to deal with people and trash and bears, and that trying to respond to grizzly bears dying on railroad tracks, shouldn't be their responsibility. This should actually be the railroad's responsibility. And the railroad really stepped up. It increased its efforts to pick up that spilled grain, to clean up the right-of-way along the tracks. They cleaned up vegetation that was overgrown along the tracks that might attract bears. And in 2001 began discussions with BNSF about the need to obtain an actual permit for future bear deaths in this corridor, especially between West Glacier and East Glacier, where there's a lot of grizzly bears. I mean, this is, like, as I said, along the southern edge of Glacier National Park. At that point, there had only been a couple dozen documented grizzly bear deaths in the corridors since 1980, and again, that number has continued to grow since then. So FWP, I should note, also began its bear conflict specialist program by hiring somebody in part through the contribution of BNSF funds. So BNSF has been, by all accounts, trying to be a good stewardship partner in this. But if you're BNSF, you really can't operate a railway through grizzly bear habitat without killing some grizzly bears. And so that's kind of where this tension is right now.
Okay, so yeah, excellent tee up. So apparently BNSF has been receptive to mitigating the mortality that's caused by their operations, as you mentioned. But let's kind of fast forward. Mortalities are still happening, as you mentioned in the data that you gave us. So what is BNSF trying to do about it now?
Well, BNSF has taken seriously pressures by Fish and Wildlife Service to apply for and obtain what's called an incidental take permit. And as part of their application for this incidental take permit, they submitted a supplementary habitat conservation plan. So let me just, I guess, by way of context and background, grizzly bears are a federally protected species under the Endangered Species Act. And so under federal guidelines prescribed by the ESA, a company like BNSF, whose very presence in grizzly bear habitat is going to result in dead bears, has to obtain this incidental take permit. And to support its application, it has to show that it's not only doing everything it can to minimize bear-train conflicts, but that it also has to mitigate or offset the consequences of bears dying along its railway. And so in exchange for essentially receiving permission from the federal government to take a federally protected species, BNSF submitted this habitat conservation plan. That includes implementing measures to reduce attractants like the ones we already addressed, as well as provide some financial support to Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, as well as the Blackfeet Nation, to hire more human bear conflict specialists. The funding totals about $2.6 million in the most recent agreement, the most recent plan that was submitted 2 years ago. It also would pay for equipment like radio collars for monitoring grizzly bears, as well as outreach and education to, for example, educate hunters as well as BNSF staff on how to identify and differentiate between grizzly bears and black bears. And so even that education component goes a long way. I guess it's, for example, one of the most recent dead grizzly bears that was reported on a trestle near Coram was initially reported by BNSF as a black bear. And it was only once FWP saw that a collared grizzly bear's mortality switch had signaled on that she went and picked up the collar and found pieces of what was clearly a grizzly. So all of that would be very beneficial for our state and tribal wildlife agencies who have their hands full dealing with human grizzly bear conflicts. The problem is versions of that habitat conservation plan and applications for this incidental take permit have been in the works since 2001. And so the most recent application was submitted and scoped for public comment in 2021. Meanwhile, bears keep dying and BNSF's trains keep rolling over Marias Pass. So there's a little bit of hand wringing going on right now where people are like, hey, when are we going to get these specialists? When are we going to finally get the incidental take permit agreement inked?
So my understanding is that it's still in this application process, right? And you kind of alluded to the fact that people are wondering why it hasn't been executed and implemented, and all the benefits that come with it put out. And so what does U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services have to say about that? Because they're the agency that reviews this application and then issues these permits. So what does, Fish and Wildlife Service have to say about this sort of stuck in limbo situation?
Well, as a federal agency, Tom, as you can imagine, it's not saying much, at least not on the record.
Yep.
But I have had, multiple sources within the agency describe their frustration with the company, meaning BNSF's delaying the conservation plan and even speculate that it's a calculated delay tactic. I've also heard from sources who say that at least some of the responsibility for the delay lies within Fish and Wildlife Services. Again, as a federal agency, that doesn't exactly come as a surprise. So who really knows? Mm-hmm. But both BNSF and Fish and Wildlife Service, in the wake of the most recent grizzly bear deaths, which only became public due to our reporting at the Flathead Beacon, there is a consensus that both entities are going to work to finalize both the habitat conservation plan and the details of the incidental take permit by the end of the year. So that's the latest that I have. According to Fish and Wildlife Services official communication channels, it's been waiting on BNSF Railway to finalize their habitat conservation plan since they closed public comment in early 2021. And similarly, BNSF says that they've been waiting for FWS to finish going through public comments, that kind of thing. So again, the habitat conservation plans don't normally take 2 years, let alone 20. So this thing's overdue, no matter who you talk to.
Right. And those folks that you talked to, in your story, you spoke with retired wildlife officials, reservation officials. Can you kind of relay their sentiment and their, I think you used dumbfoundedness about this whole situation and why implementation hasn't occurred?
Truly. And I spoke to, Buzz Cobell, who's a wildlife management specialist for the Blackfeet Nation. He's been doing this for decades, and he's been being told by both Fish and Wildlife Service and BNSF that he's going to get a new grizzly bear technician. I mean, this is a very cash-strapped resource management agency. you throw an extra body in there to help with human grizzly bear conflicts. That's huge for the Blackfeet Nation. Similarly with FWP, the person I spoke to was Tim Manley, who for 30 years was the Northwest Montana's bear human specialist, basically created the job, created the position, was at the vanguard of bear human conflict management before it even existed, and he was hired in part on BNSF's dime. So he knows how far this money can go towards creating a position that has lasting impact in a region. In fact, his bear human conflict specialist, Justine Valieres, who took over for Tim after he retired, she was hired on a temporary basis because FWP is constantly trying to find a few extra dollars to keep these seasonal employees on for what is essentially now a year-round position. I mean, bears are denning up later in the year, and they're coming out of their hibernal cycle earlier in the spring. So these people are busy, and a little bit can go a long ways.
Right. I mean, we all see the headlines. Conflict is increasing, and as a result, those wildlife agencies need to respond with more bodies, I would imagine. So looking forward, where do things stand? Do we have any idea of a timeline, or what are you looking at as far as the future on this?
Well, I can tell you that after publishing our story within 24 hours, a coalition of conservation groups had filed a notice of intent to sue BNSF if they did not move forward with their habitat conservation plan and their application for an incidental take permit. This has happened before. It happened in 2001 when the Wildlife Federation threatened to sue BNSF. That's when the wheels really started turning on this habitat conservation plan. They threatened to sue again in 2019, and now they're threatening to sue again. 24 hours after that, I had full statements from both BNSF and Fish and Wildlife Services saying that they were going to review the draft HCP and incidental take permit in earnest, and that's when that end of year deadline was promised by BNSF. Now, I should say that BNSF in that statement adamantly denied that they were that this delay was in any way a calculated strategy. One thing that we should note is that both grizzly bears, both in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem as well as the Yellowstone ecosystem, they're likely going to be delisted in the near future. The Yellowstone population's already been proposed, and by all accounts, wildlife managers are just kind of taking a wait and see approach with the NCDE. So if those grizzly bears lose federal protections, then technically BNSF is no longer on the hook to receive an incidental take permit and subsequently implement a habitat conservation plan. Now, BNSF, again, denies that this is part of a strategy. We still don't know exactly what has caused the delay, but they didn't tell me much, but they did tell me that was not the case, and that they remain fully committed to the proposed conservation plan. They look forward to expanding their grizzly bear conservation partnerships when the plan is approved.
Any final thoughts on the reporting process or the topic at hand?
Not really, other than we wrote about this, as I said, extensively in 2019, including writing a story sort of celebrating BNSF's commitment to the stewardship and preservation and conservation of grizzly bears in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. It's kind of on me that I haven't really thought about it for the last 4 years until these 3 bears got killed on tracks here in Northwest Montana. But I will say that it was a testament to the importance of grassroots reporting that within the span of a week, so much had been done, or I guess so much had that the process had been reanimated and reinvigorated in a way in direct response to our reporting. So, I feel a little bit bad that we let the story go dark for a few years, but I'm glad that we're back chasing it, and I'm glad that both the feds and a private company like BNSF, which can certainly afford to hire a couple of bear-human conflict specialists in Northwest Montana, that they seem to be taking this seriously again.
Well, thanks, Tristan. I'd encourage, any of the listeners on here to go to the Flathead Beacon's website and read the story and look out for what sounds like some follow-up reporting. Thanks, Tristan.
Thanks a lot, Tom.
Montana Untamed is a podcast from the newsrooms of Lee Enterprises Montana newspapers. Visit any of our websites or subscribe wherever podcasts are found.